They tried to cancel him 4 times. 4 times the machine came for Dave Chappelle. 4 times the think pieces were written, the petitions were signed, the venues were pressured, the networks were warned. And 4 times, Dave Chappelle sold out arenas, broke streaming records, and proved that the only thing more dangerous than a comedian with a microphone is a comedian who absolutely refuses to be silenced. And now Joy Behar, sitting at The View's famous table with that familiar smirk on her face, was about to learn something that venues in Minneapolis, executives at Netflix, and critics across America had already discovered the hard way. You don't come for Dave Chappelle unless you're prepared to lose. What happened next would become the most shared clip in television history. Not because Dave Chappelle yelled, not because he stormed off, but because he sat there, calm as a summer morning, and dismantled Joy Behar so completely that she had no choice but to flee her own show. Subscribe and drop a comment below, because this is the moment comedy won the war. The View studio felt charged with an unusual electricity that Thursday morning. The audience knew they were about to witness something special. Dave Chappelle didn't do daytime television. He didn't do promotional interviews. He didn't play the game. At 51 years old, Dave Chappelle had achieved something that few comedians ever manage. He had become genuinely uncancelable. Not because he was protected by powerful institutions, but because he had built something that existed entirely outside of them. His audience didn't need critics to tell them what was funny. They didn't need networks to approve his material. They showed up, 14 million strong, every time he released a special. And they laughed at exactly the things the cultural gatekeepers insisted weren't funny anymore. That was the man who settled into the guest chair at The View, nodding politely to Whoopi Goldberg, offering a small wave to the audience, and then turning his attention to Joy Behar with the calm, patient expression of someone who had seen this movie before and already knew how it ended. "Dave Chappelle, welcome to The View," Whoopi said warmly. She had known Dave for years, had defended him publicly when the controversies hit, and there was genuine affection in her greeting. "It's been a minute since you've done the talk show circuit." "I generally try to avoid places where people yell at each other," Dave replied, his voice carrying that distinctive rasp. "But Whoopi asked nice, so here I am." The audience laughed. Joy Behar did not. "So let's talk about the unstoppable," Sarah Haynes jumped in. 14 million views in the first week. That's incredible. What do you think resonates with people about your comedy? Dave considered the question with the seriousness he brought to everything. "I think people are tired of being told what they're allowed to laugh at. Comedy's supposed to be the one place where we can talk about anything, process anything, find the absurdity in anything. And somewhere along the way, a lot of people forgot that." "But doesn't comedy have responsibilities?" Joy interjected, and everyone at the table recognized the tone. This was Joy loading her weapon. "Don't comedians have a responsibility not to punch down, not to target vulnerable communities?" Dave turned to face her directly, and there was something almost amused in his expression. "Joy, I've been waiting for this question for about 5 years now. You want to have this conversation? Let's have it." "I think we should," Joy said, sitting up straighter. "Because your comments about the transgender community have caused real harm. People have said your specials make them feel unsafe." "Unsafe." Dave repeated the word slowly, tasting it. "You know what's interesting about that word? I grew up in Washington, D.C. in the 80s, during the crack epidemic. I've had friends shot. I've had family members struggle with addiction. I've performed in war zones for troops who were actually in danger. And now I'm being told that jokes, words, ideas spoken on a stage are making people unsafe. Words have consequences, Dave. They do. And so does silence. So does refusing to talk about things because they make people uncomfortable." Dave leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. "You know what I've noticed, Joy? The people who want to tell comedians what we can and can't say are never the ones who've actually been through anything. They're comfortable people, safe people, people who've never had to laugh to keep from crying." Joy's face tightened. That's a very convenient way to dismiss legitimate criticism. Is it criticism? Or is it an attempt to control the conversation? Dave's voice remained calm, almost gentle. Because I've noticed something about you, Joy. You've been on this show for what, 20-something years? And in all that time, you've never once been the target of the kind of campaign you're describing. You've never had venues cancel your appearances. You've never had employees at your own network stage walkouts against you. You've never had to wonder if your career was over because you said something that offended the wrong people. I've faced plenty of criticism. Criticism, sure. But cancellation? The real thing, where they try to take your livelihood, your platform, your ability to speak? No. You've always been on the side that does the canceling, not the side that gets canceled. The studio fell silent. Dave's words weren't loud, weren't aggressive, but they carried a weight that made everyone lean forward. Joy tried to regain control. We're not talking about me. We're talking about the impact of your comedy on marginalized communities. Are we? Because it seems like we're talking about power. About who gets to decide what's acceptable and what isn't. About who gets to be the arbiter of harm and who has to shut up and take it. Dave paused, letting the words settle. You know what I find interesting, Joy? In all the years of controversy around my specials, not a single person who's actually trans has ever confronted me at a show. Not one. The people who come to my shows, including trans people, they laugh. They understand that comedy is a space where we process difficult things together. That's anecdotal evidence. All evidence is anecdotal when it doesn't support your narrative. Dave smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Let me ask you something, Joy. Have you ever actually watched my specials? The whole things, not the clips that get pulled out of context. Joy hesitated for just a moment. I've seen enough to know what you're saying. That's a no. Dave nodded slowly. You're sitting here, on national television, telling me that my work causes harm, and you haven't even watched it. You've read about it, you've seen the reaction to it, but you haven't actually engaged with the material itself. I don't need to watch hours of content to understand its impact. Actually, you do. That's literally the minimum requirement for criticism. You have to engage with the thing you're criticizing. Dave's voice was getting sharper now, but still controlled. This is what I mean about the conversation being broken. You don't want to understand what I'm actually saying. You want to react to what you've been told I'm saying. Those are two very different things. Whoopi tried to interject. I think what Dave is saying is that context matters. Context always matters, Dave continued. But we live in a world where context has been declared irrelevant, where a joke can be stripped from its setup, its tone, its intention, and presented as a statement of belief, where nuance is treated as cowardice, and absolutism is treated as virtue. Joy was visibly frustrated now. You can't just hide behind "it's comedy" every time someone calls you out. I'm not hiding behind anything. I'm standing right here, talking to you, answering your questions. That's the opposite of hiding. Dave leaned forward slightly. You know who hides, Joy? People who attack from a distance. People who write think pieces instead of having conversations. People who call for cancellations instead of engaging with ideas they disagree with. I'm engaging with you right now. No, you're not. You're performing opposition. There's a difference. Dave's eyes locked onto hers. Engaging would mean actually listening to what I'm saying and responding to it. You're just waiting for your turn to repeat the same talking points you came in with. The audience stirred. Something had shifted in the room. Dave wasn't being defensive. He wasn't being aggressive. He was simply telling the truth with such clarity that it couldn't be ignored. Joy's voice rose slightly. I came in with talking points because your comedy has a documented history of causing harm to transgender people. Documented by whom? By advocacy organizations that have a vested interest in finding harm? By journalists who've never set foot in a comedy club? By academics who think laughter is a form of violence? Dave shook his head slowly. You know what's never documented? The trans people who come to my shows and laugh. The trans comedians who've told me privately that they appreciate someone actually talking about these issues instead of tiptoeing around them. The conversations that happen in parking lots after my shows, where people from different backgrounds actually talk to each other. So you're saying you know better than the experts? I'm saying I know better than people who've decided what they think before they've engaged with what I've said. That's not expertise. That's prejudice wearing a lab coat. Joy slammed her hand on the table, frustration finally boiling over. This is exactly the problem with you, Dave. You think you're so clever, so above it all, that you can dismiss any criticism as bad faith. Dave didn't flinch. I don't think I'm above anything. I'm a comedian from Washington, D.C. who got lucky. But I do think I've earned the right to be judged on my actual work, not on someone else's interpretation of it. And I think anyone who wants to criticize me should at least do me the courtesy of watching what I've made before they condemn it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow more powerful. You want to know the real difference between you and me, Joy? When I disagree with someone, I try to understand them first. I try to figure out why they believe what they believe, what experiences shaped their worldview, what they're really afraid of underneath the politics. That's how I write comedy. I find the humanity in people, even people I disagree with. And what do you think I do? You sort people into categories. Good people who agree with you, bad people who don't. And once someone's in the bad category, nothing they say matters anymore. They're just targets. Dave's voice carried something that sounded almost like pity. That's not journalism. That's not commentary. That's tribalism with a television budget. Joy stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I don't have to sit here and be lectured by someone who makes a living mocking vulnerable people. You don't have to sit here at all, Dave replied calmly. But if you leave, you're proving my point. You're showing everyone watching that when the conversation gets uncomfortable, when someone pushes back on your assumptions, you'd rather flee than engage. Joy froze, caught between her anger and the awareness that Dave was right. I've spent my entire career having uncomfortable conversations, Dave continued. I've talked about race in ways that made white people uncomfortable and black people uncomfortable. I've talked about addiction, about poverty, about violence, about sex, about every taboo topic you can imagine. And I've never once walked away from someone who disagreed with me. Because that's what this is supposed to be about. The conversation, the exchange of ideas, the attempt to understand each other. He gestured around the studio. This show is called The View because it's supposed to represent different perspectives. But what happens when one of those perspectives gets shouted down? When someone with a view that doesn't fit the approved narrative gets told they're causing harm just by speaking? That's not diversity of thought. That's enforced conformity with a diverse panel. Joy was still standing, her face flushed with anger. You think you're so brave for saying things that hurt people. I think I'm honest. There's a difference. Dave looked at her with something approaching compassion. And I think you're scared. Not of me, not of my jokes, but of the possibility that you might be wrong. That the certainty you've built your career on might not be as solid as you thought. I'm not scared of anything you have to say. Then sit down and listen. Dave's voice was gentle but firm. That's all I'm asking. Just listen. Not to agree, not to change your mind. Just to understand what I'm actually saying instead of what you've decided I must mean. The moment stretched out. The studio was completely silent. Joy Behar stood at her chair, breathing heavily, and everyone could see the battle playing out on her face. Pride fighting against the awareness that she had been outmaneuvered. Anger fighting against the realization that walking away would be an admission of defeat. In the end, pride won. I refuse to legitimize bigotry by engaging with it, Joy announced, her voice shaking slightly. She pulled off her microphone and set it on the table with more force than necessary. "Whoopi, I'll be in my dressing room." She walked off the set, her heels clicking against the floor in the stunned silence that followed. The audience watched her go, and then slowly, almost hesitantly, turned back to Dave Chappelle. He sat there, completely still, watching her retreat with an expression that held no triumph, just a kind of tired sadness. "That," he said quietly, "is what happens when you spend 20 years being told you're always right. You lose the ability to be questioned." Whoopi cleared her throat, clearly trying to process what had just happened on her show. "Dave, that was... It's okay, Whoopi." Dave turned back to face the remaining hosts, his voice returning to its normal warmth. "She's not a bad person. She's just forgotten that disagreement isn't the same as disrespect. A lot of people have forgotten that." He looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience at home. "I want to say something to everyone watching. Comedy isn't about making people comfortable. It's about making people think. It's about taking the things we're not supposed to talk about and dragging them into the light where we can actually see them. Sometimes that's uncomfortable. Sometimes it hurts. But it's necessary." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent decades thinking about these questions. The day we can't laugh at ourselves, at our fears, at our contradictions, at the absurdity of being human in a confusing world, that's the day we stop growing. That's the day we calcify into our positions and lose the ability to change. And I refuse to be part of that. I refuse to be silenced by people who think their discomfort is more important than the truth. He stood up, but not to leave. He walked closer to the audience, close enough that the cameras had to scramble to follow him. "I'm not your enemy. I'm not the enemy of trans people or gay people or any other group you want to name. I'm a comedian who believes that everything should be on the table. Everything should be available for examination, for criticism, for laughter. Because that's how we process things. That's how we heal. That's how we move forward together instead of retreating into our separate corners." He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "If this is what being uncancelable looks like, I'll take it. Not because I want to hurt anyone, but because someone has to stand up and say that the conversation is more important than the comfort. Someone has to refuse to shut up." The audience erupted into applause. Not the polite, prompted applause of a talk show, but something raw, something that sounded like relief, like gratitude, like the recognition that they had just witnessed something rare. In the days that followed, the clip would go viral. "Dave Chappelle makes Joy Behar flee her own show" would trend for a week. His words about comfort and truth, about conversation and conformity, would be quoted in articles and podcasts and late-night discussions across the country. Chris Rock would post, "That's my brother. Been saying the same things for years. Nobody listens until Dave says it." Killer Mike, Dave's touring partner, would add, "The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be spoken clearly. Dave speaks clearer than anyone I know." Even some of Dave's critics would acknowledge that Joy had handled the confrontation poorly. "You don't win arguments by walking away," one columnist wrote. "And you don't prove your opponent wrong by refusing to engage with their points." Joy Behar would return to The View the following Monday without addressing what had happened. When asked by reporters, she would insist that she refused to platform harmful rhetoric. But the damage was done. The clip existed. The moment had been captured, and 14 million people had watched Dave Chappelle prove once again that the only thing more unstoppable than a man with a microphone is a man with the truth. What do you think about this legendary confrontation? Did Dave Chappelle go too far? Or was he just speaking truth to power? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories that will leave you absolutely speechless.